Hey class, in this video we're going to be talking about text and how to render text in a P5 project. We'll also cover strings, a new data type, look at different ways to manipulate the style and format of text in our projects. So let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and open up GitHub desktop and make sure I'm on the right repository. And I'll click fetch just to make sure I've got everything up to date. And then I'm going to open up in Sublime Text. So we'll be starting with a new project this week. So we finished our self-portrait last week. This week we'll be working on our meme and logo. Today I'm just going to be doing some basic examples with some text, and then on the next video I'll be adding images. Let's also open up our Finder and add a new folder here. So I'm going to hit Command-Shift-N on Mac to make a new folder. Call this meme version 1. For this assignment you can make either a meme or a logo, whichever you prefer. To start, I'm just going to copy and paste a index and a style from my other projects, and I'll get the P5 library as well. So that way I don't have to add those things from scratch. So now I have the meme folder in Sublime. I'm gonna open that up, and I'm just gonna change the title and the header here. So this is my meme version 1. And same thing here, just replace this with meme. Again, if you're making a logo, go ahead and put logo there. Everything else I can leave the same, and then I'm going to create a new sketch file. So all of this stuff I can leave as is. There's no real reason to like rewrite all of this stuff, so I'm just going to use a copy of the index page. So to get started, I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to save this as sketch.js. And I'll make a little comment to start. I'll say this is my meme version 1, and I'll say by Owen Roberts. And I'm just going to say we're adding text and images. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the Sublime server. So we have that ready. I'm already running it, so I'm just going to leave that. So I'm going to open up a new Chrome window and go to localhost 8080 and click on MMP 210. And I haven't added the link here, so I'm just going to type it in up here. So I just type in the folder name, meme v1. And here we are. So we haven't added anything yet, so I'm just going to open up the console so we have that ready to go. And so the main thing that we're going to be looking at today is a new function called the text function. So if we go to the P5 reference and go to the typography section, you can see there's a few different functions associated with the text function. The main one is just text, and the main arguments for this function are a string, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then an X and Y position, and optionally the width and height of the text box. So I'll be going over all of those things shortly. So I'm going to go back to P5 and just set everything up. So I'm going to start with function setup. As usual, create a canvas. Just do a default 640 by 360. And that's all I need there. So then let's go to the function draw. I can make this a bit bigger. And I'll do a little background, so we have that. And then I'm just going to draw some text. So it's very simple to get started. I just use the text function. This is sort of like an ellipse or a rectangle, but instead of rendering a shape, we're going to be rendering text on the screen. The first argument for our text function is the text that we want to display, and we do that using a string. So we've actually seen some strings before. A string just has quotation marks. You can use either single quotation marks or double quotation marks. Either one, they basically work the same. Some people prefer different ones. We can use single quotation marks for now. And I'm just going to add some default text, MMP 210. So that's our string. A string is a data type in JavaScript. So besides numbers like 360 and 640, those are numbers. Our other default data type is a string. And what a string is just a string of characters. So it doesn't really matter what those characters are. The computer doesn't see them as like, MMP or 210. It doesn't really know what the meaning of the characters is like we do when we read a sentence. It just sees them as a series of characters. So it sees an M, another M, a P, a space, which is just rendered as blank space, a 2, a 1, and a 0. So even though we recognize this whole string as, being the name of the class, the computer just sees it as a string of characters. And so it doesn't really care what that string is. It just, sees those characters. So if I just try to render this, we're not going to see anything because the string needs to know where to go on the screen. So we need to give it an X and Y position. I'm going to put mine in the middle of the canvas. So I'm going to use width for the width of the canvas divided by 2, and height for the height of the canvas divided by 2. So there we see MMP 210. You'll notice that the default is this kind of sans serif font, and it's very small, and it's black. So it has a black fill. So it has a lot of similar properties to the shapes that we use in terms of the fill and the stroke for the colors. But it also has different properties because it is text. So we'll look at some different ways to manipulate the text. So let's work on styling this text, and then later we'll talk about some more properties of strings. The first thing we might want to change about the text is the text size. That's a very simple function, textSize, and we just give that a number like we would for the height of a rectangle. So the text size is going to be the height of the text. So the text size, we can use basically any number we might want to use here. It's also interactive, just like any other number in a P5 sketch. If I say the text size is mouse X, now I can actually change the text size with the mouse, or I could set it to mouse Y and move the mouse up and down like that. There's a lot of different things that I could use to change the size of the text. For now, let's just leave that at 100. So that's how we can change the size of the text. We can also change the color of the text. So if we use a fill, if I change the fill to like 255, now the text is white. I can also use our HTML colors. So if I use like plum, now we'll have the plum colored text. And you can see that plum is another example of a string. What plum is for P5 is it references that value in CSS. So if we go to our HTML color codes website and look at the names, and this should be under purple, you can see the plum value, and it corresponds to like an RGB value. So the name plum, so the text name plum is just a piece of data that is used to look up the color code and the RGB value. We can actually see that if we assign plum to be a color. So for example, if I say variable p equals color plum and then log p, we have the RGB levels for the plum as well as the alpha. So this string here is really just kind of a reference that P5 uses to go and look up these color values. So strings can be used for different things. So far we've mainly been using them for colors, but now we're actually using them for the text that we're displaying on the screen. You can see that by default there's no stroke for the text, but if we want there to be a stroke, we can say stroke. Maybe we'll add a white stroke. So it's very hard to see there, right? If we zoom in, you can kind of see it on the outlines, but we can't really see it, so we can increase the stroke weight. Now we can see the stroke a lot better. We get these sort of weird edges, and so that's something we can fix using what's called the miterLimit. This gets into some more complex stuff about how P5 actually works and how the canvas is rendering. But if we want to get rid of these like little edges here that are created when the stroke of the characters overlaps, we can just add some quick code in here. What we need to do is actually create a reference to the canvas. So I'm going to say variable canvas equals create canvas. And then I'm going to take that canvas and say drawing context dot miterLimit equals 2. The miterLimit is just basically how much it's going to allow the stroke to overlap in those edge cases. So we can see when we set it to 2, we get nice even edges. If we set it to 1, it actually gets a little too small. So now the edges kind of get cut off. So you might like that look. Let's actually increase the stroke even more. So if the miterLimit is just 1, then we get these kind of like cut off edges. If we increase to 2, then we get the square edges. If we go up from there, I think it stays the same up to a certain point. Eventually, I think if we go farther, now those edges start to overlap more and more. So again, something that you might think is interesting, but we'll leave those at 2. So, and I'll decrease the stroke weight because that's a little bit too much. So that looks a bit better. We can also change something called the text style. This is probably something that I don't use too often, but if we say text style, you can use some of your basic styling things like italic. And italic here is all caps because it's a constant variable in P5. It basically just tells it to do the italic style. We can actually see what that looks like if we go over here. It's really just a reference to the string italic. So, you know, we could also just put the string italic here and it'll work the same way, but P5 has some built-in variables called constants, which are usually all caps letters that reference, you know, different types of values. I think there's also one for bold. Yeah, so that makes it a little bit bigger. But I don't tend to use the text style. That does exist if you want to use that. And you can also look in the reference for the other functions that affect the typography. I'll go over a few more of them, but you know, those are there if you want to look at what else you can do with those. So we can also change the text font. I'm going to move this back a little bit actually because we can't really see the whole thing. Okay, so we can also change the text font. You can use any of your web-safe fonts here. So if I want to use, for example, monospace, which is what we used in the debugging tutorial, you see that now we get a different font. We do need to, again, I use double quotations here. I should be consistent with this. So again, the text, the font name is also a string. It's not a variable, right? Like we didn't say variable monospace, so we can't just use that. So we have to have quotation marks here. So there's other default fonts that we could use, anything that's web safe. So if I want a web safe font, I can just Google web safe font. We did this in the CSS video as well. And there's some different, I think CSS Font Stack is a good site. Yeah, so the one that I like this one because it actually tells you how well supported it is. So for like the monospace one that we just used. Okay, so we can actually see that on here. So let's maybe use something that's has higher support. So like the Lucida console, it has really good support on Windows, but 0% support on Mac. And so if I use that font, I'm on a Mac, so it didn't work. It's defaulting to like a serif font. So I don't want to do that. I want to use something that has a little bit higher support on both. So like Monaco has good support on Mac, but not on Windows. And Andale Mono, same thing. So here's one that has good support on Windows and decent support on Mac. Let's see if that pans out for me. No, that doesn't work either. So I'm going to go back to the monospace because I think that seems to work on Windows or Mac. Another thing that you can do is actually use like a Google font here. That one's a little bit more complicated, but you can load the font. So if I go to fonts.google.com and let's say I want another monospace font, like a kind of code font, I can go to categories and just select a monospace. And this one here looks pretty good. And so if I want to use this, I can, well, Google Fonts looks different than it used to. I don't want to download it. Oh, I can select the style over here. So I'm just going to take the regular 400 and then I'm going to embed that. And so I have to import it just like I would a CSS rule. So I'm going to copy this. So here I have to go out of my sketch.js. I'm going to go to style.css and I have to import our font. And once I have it imported, I can just use the name of the font like I would any other font. So now I can go here and say Roboto Mono. I think that's what it was. This URL has a plus because I can't use a space in a URL. So that's why Google styled it that way. But when we're referencing it, we actually just want to use a space here. So it's a bit confusing, but that should work. And so there we go. Now we have this nice Google font. So you can add web-safe fonts, but they don't always work on both Mac and Windows. With Google Fonts, we're actually loading the font data in the browser. So that one should work in most cases on either Mac or Windows. So that's a way that you can have a little bit more control over what you're going to see there. All right, so now that we've got our fonts covered, let's talk about layout and alignment. So right now you can see I'm drawing the font at 0x. So you can see the font is aligned with the left side of the page, that's 0. And then I'm also drawing the font at height over 2. So that's like, halfway through the page. I think that's the bottom. By default is going to be the bottom of our text. I'm going to move the font to width over 2. And for the moment, so you can see that the font is left aligned because when we moved the X over, the font is going over from here. I'm going to draw a couple lines just so we can visualize what we're looking at. So this is just for a visualization. This is not needed to be included in your project. So I'm going to visualize alignment. So I'm just going to draw a couple lines on the screen. So I'm going to draw a line down the middle of the screen. So from width over 2 and 0y to width over 2 and height on the y. So that should divide the screen in half. And then I'm going to draw another line. And let's actually move this guy down here. And I'm going to change the stroke here. So let's say the stroke is 0, so it'll be black, and the stroke weight, I'll do 2 so it's not totally invisible. And so I'm going to draw a line through the middle of the canvas. So 0 on X to start on the left side, height over 2 to go through the middle, width to go all the way to the right, and height over 2 again to stay in the middle. Okay, so now we've got a couple lines, and so we can visualize our alignment, and so we can see that with the default, the text is aligned on the left and the bottom. So if we want to change that, we can change the textAlign. And so with the textAlign, we have to have one argument. That first argument is going to be the right, left, or center. So the default is left. If I change that to center, now we can see the text is centered evenly on this horizontal line. I can also change the textAlign to right. And so now the right side of wherever my text is will line up with this center line. So the default, again, if I don't put anything here, is left. I can also make this left. So like with our fill and our stroke, if we set the textAlign one way and then we want to reset it, we can just set it back to left. So let's center the text. So now we have it in the middle. We can see by default the text is drawn from the bottom up on the y-axis. If we want to change that, we can add in a second argument. So it's not required, but for the textAlign, we have to have the first argument for the horizontal alignment and an optional argument for the vertical alignment. So if I put center here, now our text is centered vertically. If I put top here, now this line is where is the top of the text. So again, the default is bottom. The text draws from the bottom. So let's put that in center, and we can change that up later if we need to. So I'm going to remove this visualization. And let's actually move our text up a little bit. So I'm going to change this to bottom. And let's add a slightly longer piece of text so that we can see how the text box works. Okay, so I'm gonna go down here. I'm just gonna add like a longer piece of text. I might borrow something. You need like a whole paragraph. So maybe I'll just take the P5 description. So I'm gonna copy that and put text. And then one thing is if I paste this whole thing in here, it's kind of takes up a lot of space. So I can also save my text as a variable. So it's a little bit easier to read. So I might go up to the top here and say, description, and then just paste my description in there. So that's a very long piece of text. And so now I have this variable which references that. So when I draw it on the screen, it doesn't look quite as crazy. So let's put that one at width over 2. And let's say height over 2. And then we'll move it down a bit. So I'll say plus 100. And so we need to obviously change the text size first. So we put this up here. So we want to change the text size after this first text and before this first text, and it gets applied just like a fill or a stroke. It won't apply to the one that comes before it. It will apply to the one that comes after. So let's change the text size back to something very small, like 12 pixels. And let's turn off the stroke. So I'll say no stroke. And so now we can see the text by default just draws in this like huge line. So if we want to see that whole long paragraph, we're going to need to restrict the size of the text. So that's the optional argument. So we have, for text, we have the string, the text we actually want to draw, then the X position and the Y position. And then optionally after that, we can add a couple more arguments. So I might want to make this text be the same size as my MMP 210. So actually there's an easy way to do that using another function called the textWidth. This one works a little bit differently. It doesn't actually change the style of the text, but it returns a number that tells us how many pixels a text width would be. So I can actually use a variable to do that. So I'm going to say variable title width. We'll say MMP 210 is our title. It's going to be text width, and then we just put in the string MMP 210 here. I want to do it while I still have this text size, so that way it uses the 100 text size to tell me the actual width in pixels of the MMP 210. So then I can take the title width and use that as the width for my text box. So now we can see it's being drawn, it's adding line breaks to the text. So now we're going to want to move it over. The width, we know that the width is the same as the MMP 210, but now this width over 2 is going to be off. So actually what I probably want to do here, this is going to be a little more complicated, but probably just want to subtract the width over 2. There we go. So basically what I just said is I know what the width of MMP 210 is, and if I want them to align, I can subtract half the width from this X position to make sure that that's aligned over here. And then because we know it's the same width, then we get it aligned over there as well. This is probably a little bit trickier than anything that you might need to do in your examples, but that is something that we could do if we wanted to have the exact alignment. Just going to use some spaces here. So then I'm going to actually leave the Y, bring that up a little bit. I'm going to change the textAlign as well. And I'm going to change it to left. So even though left is the default, because this is center affecting this one, we have to switch back to left to do this one. Okay, so now that's left aligned. That looks nice. Another thing I can play with is the height. So if I don't want to show the whole thing, I can actually just restrict the height here. Okay, so it'll just show like a little excerpt. But if I want to, fit it inside a certain area, or I want all of the text to show, I just leave the height out. So the height is optional there. Okay, so that looks a bit simpler. So we have our description. Our X is this whole phrase here. The height over 2 plus 20. Let's actually move it down a little bit more. Let's do like 50 or maybe 40. And then the title width. It's not very visible because it's very small. I might make this a little bit bigger. Okay, maybe too big. Anyway, you can play around with that. I just use some default text here just as an example for using the text box. And again, all of these things are interactive. So for example, if I wanted to change the title width, I could say like plus mouse Y here. And now I can see that I'm making my text interactive. So you might not necessarily want to do this, but it is an option that you could create some interesting effects with. So let's take that out. Another parameter we have is called textLeading, and that's how much space there is in between lines of a paragraph. So we can see that down here. If I say textLeading, I think the default is going to be the text size. So if I make it like a little bit bigger, like 20, now you can see there's more space in between. If I make it like really big, it's going to make it, unreadable because there's a lot of space in between the text. I can also make that interactive. So if I say the leading is mouse Y, if Y is very low, then there's no leading. So there's actually like the text is all just on top of each other. And if we increase it, we start to see more and more and more space in between the lines. So that's text leading. We can also go backwards, which is kind of fun. So you can draw the paragraph upside down. So that's another kind of fun way to make your project interactive. I'm going to make this text even a little bit bigger because it is kind of hard to read. So that looks good. So text leading is another option. I'm just going to comment this out, just leave it the way it is. So those are the basic ways that we can style our text. We can also manipulate our text. So there's some different things we can do with the text, like the actual characters, to make them interactive as well. A really simple version of this is just using like the number of characters itself. So if I want to, animate the MMP 210, I can just draw some of the characters rather than all of them. An easy way to do that is using what's called a substring. To do that, that's a method of a string. It's a little bit more of a vanilla or pure JavaScript type thing. I can add it directly onto the end of a string. So I can say substring, and then I can just give it like a start and end. So if I say 0 to 1, we're just going to get that M. If I change this to 2, then we get MM, 3. So it just gives us a substring, the first 3 characters. But we can also change this index. So we could say, from 3 to 6 or something like that. Then we get the 2, 1. So we can get a substring of that string. And if I want to make something that's interactive, then I can change a substring based on, a number. So a better way to do this is actually to create a variable here. So let's actually make this a global variable. So I'm going to put this up here and say variable title equals MMP210. So, this is like maybe like a basic slide. I have like a title and a description. So now instead of this, I'm just going to say title here, and I'm going to use title here. So using variables is nice. If I want to change the title, I can just do it. So like if I want to change it to, MMP 210, intro to programming, this isn't actually going to fit, but I can see that it actually updates everything else along with that. Or if I just, do MMP 210 intro or something like that, you can see that it's updating my whole sketch along with the text. So that's another good reason to use variables. So if I want to make that interactive, what I can do is get the length of the text. So another thing that I can get from a string is if I have like a string here, I can say .length, and it'll tell me how many characters there are in the string. So I can map like my mouse to the length of the string. So for example, I could say variable, I'm going to use len for length. And so that's going to be title.length. Okay, so for MMP210, that's going to be 7, right? There's 7 characters, MMP space 210. So length of title. And then I'm going to map that to my mouse X. So I'll say, I'll use N for the number that we want to see, and I'll say map mouse X from 0 to width. So similar how we did our interactivity earlier. And I'll map that from 0 to the len of the title. And so now if I don't draw the title, if I draw a substring of the title from 0 to len, or to n rather, so n is the number of characters to show. I misspelled substring. So now if my mouse is over on the left, there's nothing, and if I slowly reveal the mouse, then I see the title. So that's another way that you could create some animation. We could also use like the frame count there or something. So like if I replace mouse X with frame count, eventually it'll start to reveal. And I wouldn't want to use width here. I'd want to use like a lower number. to create an animation. So if I want to like animate the title over 60 seconds or 60 frames, I can put 60 there. And so as the frame count approaches that 60, we start from 0 characters and then eventually we get up to the length of the string. And again, the nice thing with this is if we change our title, like let's say, you know, hello world, it's automatically gonna, you know, adjust my scene based on what my original variable is. So yeah, that's some basic properties of text and, you know, interacting with text and adding a little bit of animation as well. So, you know, this is kind of the first part of this project. Obviously, we're going to add images to this to create either a meme or a logo. So it's up to you what you want to do. I'll talk about that more in class. But yeah, this is going to be the end of this video. And in the next video, we'll add some images to the text that we already have. So I'm going to save this and go to GitHub and just commit it. So I'm going to say adds text example and commit to master. And I'll push that to my GitHub. So in the next video, I'll cover adding images as well. And yeah, that's it. Let me know if you have any questions.